Society may forgive a fortune lost, but never a woman's dignity compromised. The grand ballroom of the Langford estate shimmered like liquid gold beneath the cascading glow of crystal chandeliers. Each crystal prism caught the candlelight and fractured it across velvet drapes, polished parquet, and the silk gowns of the assembly. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, mingling with the faint smokiness of burning tallow. Carriages had rattled over cobblestone streets through a drizzle that had left the city slick and glistening, but inside, warmth and opulence masked the chill of winter. It was a night of social triumphs, whispered alliances, and for some, quiet ruin. She entered the room with measured poise, her gloves tight against her fingers, her posture impeccably erect, yet each step betrayed a tremor of unease. Her gown, a delicate shade of midnight blue, clung just enough to suggest refinement without arrogance, yet the subtlety of her attire drew more scrutiny than admiration. Eyes followed her across the parquet, some curious, others calculating. Conversation stilled mid-sentence. Laughter faded to polite murmurs. There was a palpable shift, as if the room itself sensed the fragile balance between shame and audacity. Whispers came first, soft as the brushing of fans against silk. "Have you heard?" She refused Lord Ratcliffe's offer, again. Another voice, sharper with delight. "Such impropriety! And alone in that state, truly scandalous." Each word, though lightly spoken, struck her like a chisel, carving away at the composure she had labored to maintain. Her cheeks flushed beneath the weight of countless invisible eyes, the heat of shame crawling across her skin. She raised her fan in a delicate, defensive gesture, yet it could not shield her from the sharp tang of gossip, nor from the subtle tilts of judgmental heads. He noticed her immediately. A duke, known for his cold charisma and relentless wit, had paused mid-conversation, eyes narrowing as he assessed her presence. There was an almost imperceptible smile curling at the corner of his lips, one that spoke of amusement and calculation in equal measure. Unlike the others, he did not flinch from the sight of her discomposure. Rather, he seemed drawn to it, as though the very air of fragility she exuded was a rare perfume he could not resist. Their eyes met across the throng, a single, electric recognition in the midst of chandeliers and murmurs. She felt it first as a subtle shiver, a prickling along her spine, though her mind warned her with precise caution. He is a man of power. He does not seek the meek nor the innocent. Be wary. Yet even as her rationality protested, her heart betrayed her, flickering with something dangerously akin to curiosity. It was then, as she moved toward the far end of the room, that he approached with the confident ease of a man accustomed to command. His coat brushed the polished floor, and his boots made no more sound than a whispered footfall, yet the hush that fell as he drew near was unmistakable. He inclined his head slightly, the movement both formal and intimate, and spoke, his voice low, smooth, and deliberate. "I shall make you an offer that no woman of sense would ever consider, yet I suspect you are not without sense nor courage." The words struck her like a thunderclap, though delivered with the gentlest of cadences. Courage? She had never considered herself brave, only cautious, careful, endlessly aware of the razor-thin margins of respectability. And yet the audacity of his gaze, the undeniable magnetism that drew her to it, rendered her momentarily speechless. He continued, leaning just so, a whisper of proximity that made the hairs on her arm rise. 100,000, my dear. For 3 days of your company, though each night shall bear its own particular conditions. Gasps floated through the periphery of the room like startled birds. Some masks of polite interest fell to revealing smirks. Others maintained decorum but glimmered with the sheen of curiosity and scandal. She, however, felt only the blood rushing to her temples, the sharp pulse of indignation tangled with a flicker of something far more perilous. She clutched her fan, its carved ivory stiff in her grasp, and lifted her chin. Pride, stubborn and brittle, demanded she retreat, yet a tremor of intrigue, against every prudent instinct, slid through her heart. The Duke regarded her, eyes steady, unyielding, yet there was a softness beneath the veneer of command. He sees me, she realized, truly sees me, even in disgrace. The knowledge struck her as both exhilarating and terrifying, a dizzying pull between repulsion and fascination. A delicate cough came from the edge of the crowd. Heads turned. The whispers began again, sharp with renewed intensity. Yet in that moment, suspended between the heat of shame and the spark of unbidden desire, she understood something she had not dared admit. The path she was about to take, however scandalous, would not be defined by society's judgment, but by the quiet rebellion of her own heart. The room spun slightly as she drew a measured breath. Her mind raced with questions, fears, and fleeting fantasies, but none so loud as the unspoken thought that danced behind her eyes. Could I dare to step into this danger and emerge unbroken? And in that charged silence, the Duke's gaze held her fast, and the first note of the story's impossible exquisite tension was struck, a note that would reverberate through gilded halls, whispered parlors, and candlelit nights to come. The choice had not yet been made, but the possibility, shocking, scandalous, and impossibly intoxicating, hung like mist above the ballroom floor, promising that nothing in her life would ever again be ordinary. A gift may conceal a truth, and a scandal may awaken a secret longing. The morning after the ball, the city awoke to frost-coated streets and the faint gleam of lamplight flickering through fog, but she remained in her chamber, a letter trembling between her gloved fingers. It was not the letter itself that unsettled her, it was the knowledge of the hand that had penned it. Sealed with a coat of arms she had learned to recognize in whispered tales and society's murmured accounts, the Duke's seal promised audacity and consequence in equal measure. She broke it with the cautious curiosity of one handling fine porcelain, her pulse keeping time with each delicate peel of the wax. Inside lay a single rose, pressed between the folds of creamy paper, and a note written in ink so dark it almost absorbed the light around it. For courage yet untested, and for the spirit that dares to meet the impossible. Consider this the first of many truths you might uncover, if you will but look beyond the fear. She stared at the rose, noting the subtle perfection of its petals, the faintest trace of dew still lingering as if it had been plucked at the break of dawn. It was a gesture that seemed to speak of more than admiration. It carried an unspoken knowledge of her shame, a recognition that she was seen even when society refused to acknowledge her presence. A shiver of something dangerously like hope crept along her spine, tempered by a sharp prick of caution. What manner of man would send a flower to a woman he had publicly scandalized, and what did he intend by it? The day brought whispers even more cutting than frost. Servants spoke in hurried murmurs as they delivered tea and letters, and news of her appearance at the ball had traveled faster than any carriage could carry a message. The city's elite regarded her as a curiosity, some with pity, others with barely contained glee. At a luncheon she had been invited to, the subject of her position was treated as a matter of polite amusement. She flaunts herself now, does she not? One lady murmured behind a fan, her voice sharp enough to cut velvet. Or perhaps she believes that a single duke's favor will erase the folly of her last acquaintance. Yet amid the gossip, there were signs that the duke's interest was no mere dalliance of scandal. Another token arrived that evening, a small leather-bound book, its cover worn but elegant, with her initials embossed upon it. Inside, in the margin of a poem, he had written a line that drew her breath in a caught whisper. Some truths require courage to be fully appreciated. Will you be brave enough to read between the lines? She spent that night by the window of her chamber, candlelight flickering across the delicate spine of the book, reading and rereading the poem with a tremulous fascination. Each carefully chosen word from him was a blade and a bomb, slicing through the walls she had built while tending simultaneously to the flickering warmth of her own curiosity. She could not decide whether to be scandalized or enchanted, whether to turn away in righteous indignation or lean into the possibility that the Duke might see something in her that no one else dared. As the days passed, the tokens continued. A glove embroidered with impossible delicacy, a sketch of her favorite garden at Langford, each accompanied by a note that walked the fine line between admiration and provocation. In society, her reputation teetered precariously. Invitations were delivered with measured hesitation. Glances were no longer neutral but loaded with inquiry and speculation. Every whispered rumor was a rope that pulled at her equilibrium. They say he is utterly besotted, and yet she has scarcely spoken to him. Private meetings, carefully orchestrated under the guise of coincidence, revealed the true purpose of these gestures. The Duke was a man who understood subtlety. He did not overwhelm, nor did he demand. He tested, suggested, and allowed the tension of uncertainty to bind them together. In his presence she felt both exposed and seen. The way he observed her, the tilt of his head, the faint arch of a brow, the briefest touch of a hand, awakened sensations she had buried beneath layers of propriety and fear. One evening, under the soft light of a gas lamp in the library, he handed her a small music box, its melody both haunting and tender. "The heart recognizes its own melody," he murmured, almost in passing, though the timbre of his voice made it impossible for her to treat the words lightly. She accepted the gift, feeling the weight of intention and the unspoken promise that each token carried. Yet for every moment of exhilaration, society's scrutiny pressed heavier. Servants, relatives, and even acquaintances measured her every response, noting when she flushed, when she faltered, and when her eyes lingered too long on a man whose audacity made even the boldest blush. She realized, with a mixture of fear and a thrill she dared not name, that the Duke's games were not without risk. To indulge curiosity was to court scandal. To resist, to deny herself the dangerous intimacy, was to betray a longing that had been quietly awakened. In the quiet hours of her chamber, she pondered the paradox. Each gift, each whispered note, each careful glance was both a test and a temptation. And with every passing day, the question loomed larger. Would she protect her dignity at the cost of an experience that promised more than mere wealth or social favor? Or would she surrender to the gravity of a connection that might destroy or redeem her entirely? As she placed the music box on her dressing table, its soft chime lingering in the air like a heartbeat, a single, unbidden thought rose to the forefront. I am already entangled, though I have not yet chosen to step fully into his world. And in that entanglement, a subtle, dangerous spark was lit. A spark that promised not only desire but transformation, scandal, and the kind of intimate awakening that society had never intended for women of her standing. The stage was set, the tokens delivered, and the whispers of society served only to fan the flames of a private, intoxicating tension that neither she nor the Duke could resist. The question was no longer whether she would encounter him again. The question was how much of herself she was willing to offer when she did. The heart confesses when the world is deaf, a soul speaks in silence. The rain had begun in earnest, drumming against the tall, arched windows of the Langford estate, blurring the gardens beyond into a haze of gray and green. She stood near the hearth of the Duke's private study, the firelight tracing flickering patterns across her gown and the anxious curve of her shoulders. Outside, the storm's fury contrasted sharply with the warmth of the room, yet within that golden glow, an entirely different tempest stirred, a quiet, urgent reckoning between two souls who had, until now, danced around one another with polite deflection and tantalizing restraint. He entered without ceremony, the echo of polished boots on the marble floor announcing him, though she had known he would come. His presence was impossible to ignore, and the room itself seemed to shift to accommodate him. He removed his gloves with a slow deliberation, revealing hands that were elegant, precise, yet capable of decisiveness. When his gaze fell upon her, it was as though he were reading her very thoughts, discerning fear from curiosity, restraint from longing. "You did not refuse my invitations today," he observed quietly, crossing the space between them with the faintest sway of his coat. "A woman of such careful discretion." He paused, letting the words hang. "It seems prudence is not always sufficient to command obedience." She offered a faint, measured smile, though it trembled at the edges. "Prudence," she said softly, "has ever been a poor shield against curiosity and perhaps folly. I confess, I am sometimes too easily swayed by that which fascinates me, and yet I must not betray more than I am willing to endure." He inclined his head, the ghost of a smile brushing his lips, as though her acknowledgment pleased him more than outright defiance ever could. "Endure," he repeated, the word low and resonant, "is perhaps a harsh term. I do not seek endurance from you, nor compliance. What I seek is the truth, however inconvenient, however inconveniently placed it may be." She felt the heat of his gaze, the quiet weight of expectation, and something within her, a fragment of pride, a flicker of fear, and a pulse of longing, shook in tandem. The Duke's presence had always unsettled her, but now, in the intimacy of the study, where shadows danced along bookshelves and the fire's warmth kissed her cheeks, the effect was profound. She found herself inhaling against a tide of reason, against a lifetime of ingrained caution. "I have feared this meeting," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for what you may ask of me, but for what I might find within myself should I comply. I am not accustomed to such attention, and yet it has awakened something I scarcely understand." He stepped closer, careful to maintain the proprieties demanded by society, yet ignoring the space his proximity seemed to shrink. "Perhaps," he said, his voice softening, "that which awakens is not to be feared. Perhaps it is the very measure of what it means to be alive, seen for who we truly are, beyond the masks of expectation." A silence followed, weighted and exquisite, where the only sound was the subtle crackle of the fire and the rhythmic pulse of rain against the panes. She could feel it in her chest, the slow, undeniable ascent of something dangerous and profound. Her fingers tightened upon the edge of her gown, and yet she did not move to retreat. Instead, she spoke a truth she had guarded fiercely. "I am afraid of being known," she said, her voice trembling with honesty. "Afraid that if you see me fully you will recoil as others have, and yet I find I wish, against reason, to be seen." He regarded her for a long moment, the faintest shadow of something akin to sorrow passing across his features. "To be seen is a rare gift," he murmured. "And to offer it willingly is an act of courage greater than any social dalliance or fortune could ever require." He paused, then, as though daring himself, admitted, "I, too, have been measured and found wanting in the eyes of those who claim to understand men. And yet, here, in this fleeting interval, I find myself wanting nothing more than your acknowledgement that you, too, are willing to see me as I am, flawed, lonely, and in search of some connection that transcends pretense." Her breath caught at the vulnerability in his words, a stark contrast to the commanding, unapproachable image he projected in society. She had known him as formidable, as magnetic, as mercilessly self-possessed. Now she saw a fragility beneath the armor, an honesty that demanded a response she could scarcely measure. "I am willing," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of both defiance and surrender. "Willing to risk shame, to confront my own fears, if only to know the truth of your own heart." The Duke's gaze softened and a rare, unguarded smile curved his lips. "Then let us speak honestly," he said, his voice lower still, almost a confession. "Not as Duke and Lady, nor as society demands, but as two souls who have wandered through judgment and secrecy, and who have stumbled into the possibility of something real." The room seemed to contract around them, the storm outside forgotten, the only reality the small circle of firelight and mutual recognition. He extended his hand, not as a gentleman of station offering propriety, but as a man seeking connection. She placed hers within it, feeling the warmth, the deliberate weight, the unspoken promise. For a long moment they held the silence, the space between them charged with unuttered confessions, tentative trust, and burgeoning desire. And in that pause, she understood that the choice she faced was no longer merely about dignity or scandal, but about surrendering to a connection that might illuminate or upend every carefully guarded corner of her life. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across her face, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a world where shame was not the measure of her worth, and where the truth of the heart outweighed society's relentless judgment. The storm outside raged, but within the study, a quiet, transformative calm took hold, an intimate turning point, delicate and irrevocable, that would determine the course of both their hearts. And as she met his eyes once more, the unspoken question loomed between them, electrifying in its clarity. Will we, for a fleeting and forbidden interval, allow ourselves to be fully known, and risk everything that follows? To surrender not the body but the heart, is the truest defiance of society. The ballroom of the Montclair estate gleamed with the full brilliance of gaslight and crystal, every prism catching the flames of hundreds of candles and splintering them across polished parquet and gilded walls. She entered with measured grace, her gown of deep emerald catching the light and drawing every eye, yet her posture betrayed no eagerness, only an unspoken defiance. Whispers arose like shadows in the corners of the room. Is it true? Has she consented to the Duke's arrangement? Their voices were sharp, eager to judge, to dissect, to cast her as either victim or transgressor. She felt their gaze, the weight of scrutiny pressing upon her, yet she moved forward, spine straight, heart brimming with a quiet, reckless courage. He waited at the center of the room, hands behind his back, yet every inch of his posture radiated a command both imperious and intimate. Their eyes met across the throng, a silent conversation bridging the distance. The Duke's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, and in that instant, the gossip of 100 tongues dissolved into irrelevance. He did not merely see her, he acknowledged her. As the orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, he approached with the deliberate ease of a man accustomed to shaping his world. "I see you not as society would define you but as you are," he murmured, voice low yet deliberate, carrying over the soft rustle of silk and whispered curiosities. "And it is enough for me." Her chest rose and fell with careful control, yet the pulse beneath her ribs betrayed her composure. "Enough," she repeated inwardly. "Enough to pierce the veil of judgment, enough to defy the world that would condemn her." Slowly, she extended her hand, and he took it as though it were the most natural gesture in the world, though the entire assembly seemed to hold its breath. The smallest touch, the faint pressure of fingers interlacing, carried the weight of unspoken confessions, private battles, and the daring intimacy that society sought to suppress. The whispers grew louder, yet for once they seemed irrelevant. The Duke spoke again, his voice carrying authority, passion, and a peculiar tenderness. "I offer no promise of comfort from gossip, no guarantee against censure. But I promise that within this moment, and within these days, the truth of my regard is yours. And if you are willing, the truth of your heart may be mine as well." She felt the tremor of both fear and exhilaration course through her. All her life she had been trained to measure, to ration, to defend. And yet here she was permitted, dared, to surrender not to fortune, not to title, but to a recognition of mutual truth. Her gaze met his steadily, an unspoken vow carried in the strength of her eyes. Then let us not be defined by whispers, nor by the judgment of others. Let us be defined only by what we choose to be here and now. A murmur ran through the room. The music swelled, and for a brief, suspended interval, time itself seemed to hesitate. The Duke drew her into the dance with the natural elegance of a man who commanded attention yet had learned to cherish restraint. Their bodies moved with exquisite harmony, each step a statement of quiet defiance, each glance an assertion of understanding and desire. The assembly watched, captivated not merely by beauty, but by the audacity of a connection that dared to exist despite the rigid strictures of propriety. And yet the climax was not in the dance, but in the truth laid bare between them. He spoke, a whisper carried just above her ear, intimate and resolute. Society may choose to misinterpret, to condemn, or to mock. But you, your courage, your dignity have already triumphed. And I will not let it be otherwise. Her breath caught, and she realized that the tension that had haunted her for weeks, the delicate balance between scandal and desire, fear and longing, had at last crystallized. No longer were they players in a game defined by the gazes of others. In that moment, each heartbeat, each subtle movement, each deliberate touch was theirs alone. The storm of society raged around them, but it was powerless to extinguish the quiet blaze of recognition and consent that had ignited between them. The music softened, yet they did not release each other. His hand remained over hers, his gaze locked with hers, steadfast and unyielding. She allowed herself, for the first time in months, to inhale fully, to feel the warmth of firelight not as a shield but as an illumination of possibility. Society might whisper, might scoff, might measure and condemn, but the truth they shared, unspoken yet absolute, was impervious. She leaned slightly toward him, a subtle gesture, and he met it with the gentlest tilt of his head. In that single motion, a promise was conveyed, of courage, of restraint, of tenderness forged in a crucible of social peril. And though the ball continued, with its glittering chandeliers and murmuring witnesses, their private victory was undeniable. The Duke's voice, quiet but carrying the weight of certainty, echoed softly in her mind. We have survived their judgment and in doing so have found something infinitely rarer, the freedom to choose our hearts even when the world refuses to yield. And so, in the glow of crystal and firelight, amidst the whispered intrigue of 1,000 onlookers, the declaration was made, not in scandal nor in perfumed rumor, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of two hearts resolved to defy expectation. The resolution was not complete, for life would continue its ceaseless march, and society would continue its scrutiny, but the essential victory, the irrevocable shift, had occurred. She had chosen courage. He had chosen recognition. And together, in that exquisite defiance, they had declared their own sovereignty over heart and honor, leaving the world to wonder, and them to begin the slow, intoxicating work of discovering what it truly meant to be seen and loved, without reservation. In the theater of scandal, only the heart writes its own redemption. The dawn crept over the city in pale streaks of gold, catching on frost-tipped rooftops and gilded balustrades, yet inside the Duke's estate, the world seemed suspended in a breathless stillness. The previous night's ball had passed, with its whispers, glances, and silent speculations, yet the tension between them had not eased. It had crystallized into something both fragile and unshakable. She stood by the broad window of his private suite, the winter light falling on her face, and for the first time allowed herself to feel the full weight of the choices she had made. Courage, scandal, desire, all had collided, leaving her poised on the cusp of a truth she could neither retreat from nor ignore. He entered the room quietly, not with the command of a duke addressing society, but with the intimacy of a man approaching a heart he had come to cherish. His eyes, steady and deliberate, lingered on her with a mixture of admiration, tenderness, and unspoken promise. She felt the stirrings of fear and exhilaration, not of scandal now, but of complete surrender, an exposure of self that went far beyond wealth or station. I feared for a moment, he said, his voice low and resonant, that society's judgment might fence us in, that your courage could be tempered by the whispering of 1,000 eyes. But you have chosen otherwise. You have chosen to define your own heart. She met his gaze, steadying her breath. And you have chosen to see me, not as a curiosity, not as a scandal, but as myself. That is the most dangerous choice of all. He smiled faintly, and the warmth in his expression was such that she felt the last traces of her hesitation fall away. "Dangerous," he murmured, "because it carries the weight of freedom. To love, fully and without reservation, is the most exquisite peril a soul can endure." Their hands met, deliberate and unyielding, bridging the space of doubt, fear and societal expectation. For a long moment, the world beyond the glass panes, the gossip, the judgment, the constraints of propriety, ceased to exist. In that concentrated interval, all that remained was the unspoken confession of two hearts, forged in restraint and revelation, finally permitted to converge. He stepped closer so that the faintest warmth of his body brushed against hers and whispered, "We have survived their scrutiny, their insinuations, their assumptions. And now, we are free to write our own truth. Here, together, whatever the world may say." She inhaled sharply, the quiet gravity of his words pulling her toward the precipice of surrender. To be seen, fully and without reservation, is more daring than any act of society could demand. Her lips parted, trembling with a mixture of relief, desire, and triumph. "Then let us write it together. Not in whispers, nor in the shadow of scandal, but in the quiet certainty of knowing, we are ours above all else." The storm of social expectation that had loomed for weeks finally dissipated, replaced by an unspoken understanding, a delicate intimacy that was stronger than gossip, wealth, or position. Their bond, forged in courage and confession, had triumphed over every obstacle: judgment, propriety, fear, and doubt. In that moment, neither title nor fortune mattered, only the truth of their connection endured. He drew her into an embrace that was firm yet reverent, their foreheads touching in a gesture that communicated what words could scarcely contain. Her hands rested lightly upon his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart she had come to know as both strong and tender. There was no need for declarations beyond the touch, the quiet affirmation of recognition, trust, and unreserved devotion. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent and unaware, but within the warmth of the suite, a private triumph had been claimed. They had navigated scandal and temptation, confrontation and confession, and emerged intact, irrevocably linked by courage and desire. In the glow of early morning, the Duke's voice, soft and unwavering, broke the silence once more. "Let the world speak as it will. We have chosen each other, and that is a triumph no whisper, no scandal, no fortune could undo." She rested her head against his shoulder, the tumult of weeks giving way to a serenity she had never before known. The tension, the longing, the unspoken perils, all had converged to produce this singular moment of clarity, intimacy, and liberation. Their hearts, no longer fettered by society's gaze, had claimed their own narrative, written not in rumor or obligation, but in the deliberate, irrevocable truth of love. And so, in the quiet aftermath of judgment, whispers, and intrigue, the final victory belonged to them, not to the assembly, not to fortune, not to expectation, but to courage, to desire, and to the delicate, enduring sovereignty of two hearts that had dared to be fully seen. The world could watch, could whisper, could scorn, but within the intimacy of that suite, amid firelight, frost, and quiet triumph, they were free. Fully, completely, and irrevocably.